Most welcome to H1278. An incredibly clement November morning. And good morning to you. We will continue with the trodden path of the science of inhibition. There are so many interesting connections to quantum physics and the Newtonian paradigm. Why is or what is structure? It caught my interest to deepen and widen the understanding. I continue on page 19 where I left off in lecture 1277. There is some evidence that movement and postural control are parallel systems working to provide planning and support respectively. Behavior that looks like failure to inhibit or stop endgaining may in fact be using movement such as lurching to try to solve postural problems such as stiffening. The student may require a calm state of mind to focus on postural control rather than movement planning. In this case, the skill of Alexander technique inhibition and not endgaining may in fact involve learning to work consciously with postural control rather than movement planning. Proactive inhibition may be broad enough concept to encompass many of the 80 phenomena that we've mentioned. Recall that unlike reactive inhibition, which initiates after a stimulus is present, proactive inhibition refers to preparatory processes and states active before the stimulus. Proactive inhibition may either facilitate reactive inhibition. Or eliminate the need for a reactive process. This definition seems to include a wide range of processes and states. Consider, for example, the quiet observational state described in I3. The moment of awareness within yourself in which you are so quiet that you can observe everything. How your body is reacting to the outer stimuli or to a mental pattern. Only in this moment you will be able to recognize them, stop them, and choose something else. The practitioner refers to a preparatory state that allows them to observe bodily reactions and thus choose alternatives. Body awareness, as described in I2, I start to feel tense in my neck and legs. I remember then that I can stop doing that. And E4, I noticed I was tightening my neck upon wishing my direction, my physical block in my neck went away, and the thoughts began flowing rather instantly. Provide advanced warning signals that facilitate upcoming reactive inhibitory tasks. Or it might strengthen the availability of alternative reactions that eliminate the unwanted responses altogether. Solving movement problems by tuning the postural system as described by Cacciatore might involve inhibiting movement plans using proactive inhibition. At the same time, postural tuning may make available new movement patterns, allowing unwanted movement responses to be dissociated from stimuli before they are activated. The correlations between posture and inhibition from the work of Baer may suggest that refined proactive inhibition is a necessary skill in preventing maladaptive postural habits. The authors also point to the evidence that extreme forward position makes reaction happen more quickly, which might influence inhibitory responses proactively. All of these examples require diverse psychomotor skills that can't be pigeonholed into one simple stopping mechanism, but can be categorized generally as proactive means of changing the response. Research into defining and categorizing proactive inhibition is still in an explorative phase, meaning lots of potential, but lots of unknowns. It is neither as well studied nor as well defined as reactive inhibition. In fact, since proactive inhibition may include both persistent states and short-lived processes, it cannot simply categorized as an executive function, while a broad range of physiological processes might contribute directly to proactive inhibition. It is not clear exactly what these processes are. Attentional habits, stopping goals, motivation, and bodily states may all affect inhibitory response. This means that improving proactive inhibition involves a diversity of task-specific mechanisms. Expanding the dialogue between Alexander technique practitioners and scientists on these and other topics might be mutually beneficial. Alexander teaches can benefit from the wealth of science relevant to their work. This includes work on proactive inhibition, studies that connect postural states to reactive processes, and studies of the posture and movement systems, and how they work together to plan and support goal-directed behavior. Alexander technique teachers also may benefit from describing experiences and observations objectively to make their work more accessible. Scientists interested in interactions between somatic states and cognitive processes may benefit from looking at Alexander technique phenomena and observations. They offer rich examples of how patterns of muscle tensions and posture interact with cognitive and behavioral processes. One of the most interesting questions is how the decision is made that determines whether the A and S will rest and digest in the parasympathetic state, or whether it will sound the alarm for a full-fledged fight or flight response in the sympathetic state. Another good question considers how the A and S relates to the readiness potential. That Walter Carrington and Benjamin Libet draw to our attention. The sympathetic nervous system is a crisis manager which takes us back into the high performance of animal reaction time. The sort of precision that animals have while either being hunted or doing the hunting. The conscious mind is reduced to the present moment, excluding all extraneous information. There is a third possibility as well, that of emotional paralysis, as experienced by a deer caught in the headlights, which occurs when the animal cannot decide between fight or flight. It is actually a psychophysical state of trauma, which is best explained by Gregory Bateson's double bind theory, which will be presented later in section 2. Two hormonal reactions occur in this process. A very small structure in the brain stem, the locus coeruleus, is made up of 3,000 neurons, quite uniquely communicate with 1/3 to 1/2 of the tissues of the brain. It is responsible for the release of noradrenaline, which alerts organs to enter a high performance state of readiness. Within moments, and the adrenal glands to release adrenaline, which speeds up the heart. Muscles are tensed, profuse sweating, or goosebumps can appear. Blood vessels are constricted, and very often time distortion permits a heightened awareness of survival choices. Fortunately, the wisdom of the body has provided an opposing and self-healing system within the rest and digest branch of the ANS, the parasympathetic. This branch is responsible for growth hormones, energy storage, restorative sleep, as well as subtle states of awareness necessary for fine psychophysical tuning, daydreaming, and other modes of creative and intuitive thought. Sorry, I needed that. Oh, but sorry. After the need for crisis behavior is past, the parasympathetic branch recalibrates the entire nervous system by slowing the heartbeat, decontracting blood vessels, and eliminating the residues of crisis, adrenaline and lactic acid. Looking more closely at the ANS, we see that the survival, flight, or flight state is driven by a chain reaction of sympathetic nerves emanating from the thoracic region all the way up to the lumbar region of the spinal cord. The rest and digest state, on the other hand, is induced by the parasympathetic nerve fibers which originate above the spinal cord or in the midbrain, medulla and pons, and also from the sacral region of the lower spinal column. To switch to a sympathetic dominance of the nervous system is the switch to a sympathetic dominance of the nervous system is triggered during emergencies or imagined emergencies. The two autonomic nervous systems, the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic, has a dynamic balance that these two uses in the autonomic nervous system is a constant challenge for humans who live in a civilization that insists on quantitative production rather than qualitative performance process. The following is a perfect description of a psychophysical pathology. That haunts every one of us if we approach intellectual endeavors. Very important here. Intellectual endeavors with an end-gaining performance anxiety. The sympathetic, which is the flight or fight, dilates pupils, inhibits salivation, accelerates respiration, accelerates heartbeat, inhibits digestion, secretes adrenaline, increase sweat, raises the hair follicles, give goosebumps, relaxes bladder, stimulates orgasm, whereas the parasympathetic constricts pupils, stimulates salivation, relaxes respiration, slows heartbeat, stimulates digestion, decreases sweat, relaxes the hair follicles, constricts bladder, stimulates sexual arousal. When people are ruled by their sympathetic nervous system, life slowly becomes more and more uncomfortable. It is imperceptible at first because all they are aware of is the hardship and the oppressive situation, or the thrill or the adrenaline rush. Over time, as the sympathetic has the perpetual upper hand, it will slowly become more and more difficult to relax and to give in to the parasympathetic. Once caught in this vicious circle, sleep and appetite become effective. Alcohol and other kinds of suppressants may be sought in a vain attempt to give the sufferer an imitation of what their own parasympathetic is waiting to give them. Later on, backache, migraine, repetitive strain or ulcers. These are all signs that the switch to the sympathetic nervous system has become stuck. The deep trouble, next paragraph, the mind-body problem versus body-mind dissociation. The phrase deep trouble is used in philosophy to identify a flawed fundamental belief which, once discovered, forces scientists and philosophers to rethink all their assumptions. It is the sort of thing that makes a paradigm shift. I have chosen one of the oldest unresolved classical troubles, which is called the mind-body problem, and contrasted it with the dilemma we often face as Alexander teaches when dealing with what is now recognized by psychology as body-mind dissociation. The mind-body problem is usually attributed to the writings of René Descartes in the 17th century, though strains of this problem can be traced back to the early Greek philosophers. In 1623, Descartes decided to embark upon an experiment as challenging as Alexander's. They each came to the conclusion that they lacked proper methods to solve their problems. And that this was because they were operating on flawed beliefs that they had simply accepted as reality. Descartes dared to put all that he knew in doubt, and even went so far as to question his own existence. His conclusion, "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum," is probably familiar to most of you. His process for reaching this conclusion, which you can find in his very accessible discourse on method, or his meditations, is very likely to remind you of Alexander's description of his early experimentation with self-observation. The difference was that Alexander used a mirror to reflect upon his use. Descartes used introspection to reflect upon his existence. Their results were quite different. Descartes decided that the mind was not physical. In parenthesis from me, what on earth that would mean. And Alexander believed that such mind-body separation was exactly the erroneous preconceived idea that destroyed psychophysical unity and retarded human potential. Descartes' conclusions have influenced and defined the limits of intellectual practice in Western civilization during the last 3 centuries. Today, most scientists and philosophers recognize mind-body dualisms as Descartes' error. However, what affects us as teachers is that mind-body dissociations, which is one of the negative results of Descartes' experiment, remains embedded in both the pedagogy and the theory of every discipline. The reason why dualism and rational reduction were so successful is simply that his concept proved to be amazingly useful thought experiments which made the advancement of technology possible. And here is two perspectives from the authors, which is well worth remembering. The first one, it is important to know that terminology here becomes quite confusing because of an intellectual tradition that permits a scholar or scientist to borrow an idea or part of an idea from an earlier scholar and give it new meaning, even an opposite meaning. Perspective 2. Descartes' dualism states that the mind soul is completely separate, objective, thinking entity that interacts with a mechanically organized physical body within a mechanical universe. Descartes' rationalism states that the mind and its knowledge are innate, and that certainty will be gained through rational reductionism, which focuses on the detailed parts of the problem. This rational dualism is later contrasted with John Locke's empiricism, which states that the mind is a blank slate at birth. Oh, very sorry. And that all thinking is based on sensory experienced, processed through the mechanism of the physical body. Various combination of soul, mind, and machine are in constant competition throughout the following centuries. For the rationalist, it is enough to think through a problem and disdained the empiricists, materialists. Who say it is not real unless the result can be exactly reproduced through sensory experience, or in a laboratory experiment, as we will see below in the section on consciousness. The terms keep being refined or even reshaped into their exact opposites. The tension between rationalist, objective materialist, and introspective, phenomenological programs of research continues to this day. This is the result of the mind-body problem. Ironically, as these intellectual practices have become more sophisticated, they have also proved themselves through their own rigorous application to be based on mental attitudes which are the least appropriate for understanding lived experience. And the deepest trouble of all is that while most reductionists' thinking are still caught in the mind-body dissociation because their mental training was based on Cartesian dualism. It is because of this dilemma that the Alexander technique is a technique of re-education and not education, which it could be. It is important for us to fully appreciate how it came to be that we need to be re-educated, that our minds must rediscover access to primary control, because it is in our minds that lost it through body-mind dissociation. It is equally important to remember that not all dissociation is damaging. It is dualism linked with certainty that is the real problem. As long as dissociations created by as if proposition are seen as working ideas and not as certainty, we are able to imagine, to create abstract concepts like relativity theory, to paint marvelous pictures, or to perform as if we were Romeo and Juliet. It also allows us to manage crisis by issuing a calming as if it will be okay, which neutralizes the A and S fight or flight response. And it is our Alexander inspired as if intentions of forward and up that provides us with the opportunity to dissociate new movements from our habitual overdoing. However, the negative aspects of dissociation occur all too easily unless we have been fortunate enough to experience the creative pedagogy of experimental schools, most of us have been taught to use ourselves as Descartes instructed. The resulting pedagogical system, which has trained and continues to train our thinking mind, has forgotten to tell us that dualism, and with its dissociation, is simply a working idea. For centuries, children have been taught to set aside their organic knowledge and curiosity, to sit still without even being taught stillness, to prohibit spontaneous daydreaming, which is often the brain's method of non-doing. Integration, the brain's non-doing integration. And to pay attention to a teacher who will provide them with facts about objective reality. On which they are to be judged as worthy human beings. We received warnings about this sort of pedagogy as early as 1904 from the eminent philosopher John Dewey, who applied pragmatism to progressive education, insisted that traditional dualistic education could only retard an already alert human mind. It is the core problem that haunts cognitive science today. The dualistic mode of teaching, learning, is not congruent with the reality of brain function as we now know it. We find ourselves trained in a dualistic method that excludes correction except from its already debauched cognitive perspective. The division in question is so deep-seated it has affected our language. We have no word which to name mind, body in a unified wholeness of operation. For if we said human life, few would recognize that it is precisely the unity of mind and body in action to which we were referring. Consequently, when we endeavor to establish this unity in human conduct, we still speak of body and mind, and thus unconsciously perpetuate the very division we are striving to deny. The very problem of mind and body suggests division. I do not know of anything so disastrously affected by the habit of division as this particular theme. Thus, the question of integration of mind-body in action is the most practical of all questions we can ask of our civilization. Be beware also of so-called concentration. This is true for the attitude of attention required for children in schools. It dissociates the brain instead of compacting it. Personally, I do not believe in any concentration that calls for effort. It is a wish the conscious desire to do a thing or think a thing, which results in an adequate performance. Today, we know that endgaining pedagogy is the very basis of body-mind dissociation, since it presupposes that a teacher can take a child's mind and develop it, implying that it is quite separate from the troublesome character who is wriggling uncomfortably in a chair. Well, the author is rather hilarious. Eventually, that character may prove to be a well-balanced and successful intellectual, or a workaholic casualty of the sympathetic ANS, driven to achieve external validation, or a slow learner who may succeed in spite of humiliation or an embedded sense of low self-esteem, or even someone who completely fails to accommodate the mind-body problem and simply learns to detest all intellectual endeavors. As Alexander teaches, we are grateful to have discovered quite a different sort of pedagogy, and know very well that learning useful information need not eliminate an interest in the quality of lived experience. In teaching, we might find it useful to recognize which form of dissociation our students are dealing with, because the conversion to psychophysical congruence is sometimes quite different. Depending on which survival strategy a student has developed. It might be equally interesting for us to identify which strategy we developed before learning the Alexander technique, since we may carry unconscious prejudice from that direction. For those of you more interested in psychology, there are even more serious results of the mind-body problem. They are the manifestations of dissociative pathology found in addictive disorders, and double-bind communication disorders, which compartmentalize parts of a personality and produce behavior which at its extreme is diagnosed as a multiple personality disorder. Double-bind is a term created by Gregory Bateson. And a parenthesis here, we have gone through double-bind in the 700s of the series, 730 I would believe. While studying the communication pattern of families of schizophrenics, it is defined as a communication pattern which, in its negative form, offers two untenable choices, causing the mind to both fixate attention like the deer in the headlights and split in an endless either or search for a correct context. Sorry about the interruption. I will repeat the last one to get back into focus. Double-bind is a term created by Gregory Bateson, while studying the communication pattern of families of schizophrenics. It is defined as a communication pattern which, in its negative form, offers two untenable choices. Very important, because this, in parentheses here, parallels exactly the wave particle problem and why we have such difficulties understanding. End of parenthesis. Sorry about my comments. Offers two untenable choices, causing the mind to both fixate attention, like the deer in the headlights, and split in an endless either-or search for a correct context. The ANS is triggered by emotional frustration, and if this sort of communication is the norm, the lesson of helplessness will ultimately embed a chronically depressive state or a substance addiction as a substitute resolution. Or even worse, a traumatic pattern of multiple personality disorder. It seems more and more clear that the underlying mind-body dualism makes us vulnerable to this trauma. A trivial example of double bind is: you didn't eat your dinner. Don't you love your mother? If this sort of communication were delivered in all its many forms, as if it were perfectly sensible and with a prohibition against saying it is crazy or inappropriate, the receiver would be vulnerable to the above stated pathologies. It was later discovered that, and it now gets interesting, listen carefully. It was later discovered that schizophrenia was a pathology of the brain, and that what Bateson had been treating was actually dissociative personality order, resulting from repeated and consistent emotional trauma via communication. Surprisingly, it is also possible to create a positive double bind, of which Japanese Zen meditation koans are a perfect example. It has been suggested that Alexander directions forward and up could create a positive double bind by distracting us from the temptation to end game by giving two positive but seemingly contradictory directions. It is our hope that you follow us through this labyrinth of ideas. You will develop empathy for your own mind-body condition. In particular, I hope that as teachers, you will develop a genuine compassion for those intellectuals who wrestle every day with a mind-body problem. Most of them have no idea that they carry a deeper body-mind problem that continues to remain the primary obstacles to their complete success. Very few of them have ever heard of Frederick Matthias Alexander, or if they have, it has not touched their minds as it might have touched their bodies. In the following section, we will see how ideas concerning consciousness and experience at the turn of the 20th century are gaining new respect after having been held in disdain in the mid-20th century by the empiricists, the materialists, and the behaviorists. And now there is a brief overview of consciousness research in the last 2 centuries. (1889), James. Something happens when to a certain brain state, a certain consciousness corresponds, a genuine glimpse into what it is would be the scientific achievement before which all past achievement would pale. 95. Chalmers' heart problem. Consciousness poses the most baffling problems in the science of mind. There is nothing that we know more intimately than conscious experience, but there is nothing that is harder to explain. All sorts of mental phenomena have yielded to scientific investigation in recent years. But consciousness has stubbornly resisted. Many have tried to explain it. But the explanations always seem to fall short of the target. Some have been led to suppose that the problem is intractable and that no good explanation can be given. Consciousness has so many meanings in so many different contexts. The word conscious has multiple meanings. It is used to mean awake, responsible, and aware, for example. The words unconscious, subconscious, and non-conscious have been coined in different eras and have changed throughout the 20th century in particular. Alexander himself defines subconscious to mean instinct and or habitual behavior. Since the 1940s, the old usage of subconscious is no longer acceptable because more precise terms were coined, such as Cannon's concept of homeostasis, Maturana and Varela's concept of autopoiesis, and Tinbergen's differentiation of instinct from habit. It is for this reason that today's field of cognitive science is struggling to clear up the confusion created by the vocabulary of its different disciplines. We ourselves live in a language use that carries layers of cultural myth. For example, the words sunrise and sunset. We certainly know today that they are more accurately represented as the planet Earth turning. And that one I'm not so sure about. Wittgensteinian remark here, but it's beside the point, so do forget it. The words conscious, unconscious, subconscious, and non-conscious more often fall into this sunset category that can change in meaning from moment to moment. Though Alexander's vocabulary emerged from the mind over matter dualism of the early 20th century, conscious control of the psychophysical mechanism, the technique has always lacked the sort of definition which would be acceptable in a world that runs on mind-body dualism. The word conscious and use clearly point to a responsibility for one's action. But in the world of mind-body dualism, those words were reserved for an examination of moral conscience, not one's psychophysical actions. These two attitudes, the moral and the psychophysical, seem to merge in Alexander's writings as he reacts to the devastation of World War. Quote, "If we face the facts, every honest man and woman on this earth today must admit that each and every one of us is more or less responsible for the crisis of 1914 and 1939. How could Hitler or Mussolini or any such have reached the position they occupied during the war unless on the one side they had the necessary support and on the other the ideas and principles they stood for had been acceptable to the people who supported them. Surely those wanting peace would have accepted the responsibility of the carrying out of the only reasonable means to that end, the prevention of the importation of essential materials into Germany and Italy in quantities necessary for the creation of a gigantic war machine. After each of the two wars, the entire Western world gave only lip service to reviewing what was wrong that caused these wars to happen. Alexander was determined to address the question, and his apparent negativity in doing so must be understood by the modern reader in terms of an aftershock of war. He was, as always, focused on use and prevention and how they affect functioning and dysfunction. I have to say I'm in complete disagreement with the authors of this article when it comes to this little thing here. I agree with Alexander. At the turn of the 21st century, this dysfunction is still unresolved, and as we shall see, researchers in the field of consciousness studies are facing some of the same problems of being heard. With all the present day technology, much of the brain's functions have been revealed, but Chalmers' hard problem remains the ultimate challenge for the disciplines of philosophy, of mind, and neuroscience. If science cannot adequately define consciousness, how can we form an adequate definition of constructive, conscious control of the individual without a full understanding of where the technique fits and does not fit into our cultural traditions? We may forever stumble through our definitions and be relegated to the recent category of body workers. It is very important for us as teachers to recognize that we are still in a culture in recovery from the dominance of reductionist behaviorism without even necessarily knowing what it was. During the last 100 years, there have been many decades where the study or research of consciousness was discarded in favor of more materialistic behaviorism. Behaviorism forced psychophysical research into a regressive stance which rejected any professional interest in the field of consciousness studies. And with it, all innovative experiential research models, such as the Alexander technique. When you try to specify and define the technique, you may often find that your words seem empty, or that your listener has taken on a prove it to me attitude with a disdain for esoteric fluff. It is essential that we take into consideration this cultural prejudice rather than thinking the technique cannot be rationally explained. A good example of such an explanation can be found in Frank Pierce John's article, Frederick Matthias Alexander and the education of feeling. It is not possible in a short paper to provide you with a detailed picture of Western intellectual and psychological development. I can, however, recommend an amazing but rigorous overview by Randall Collins called The Sociology of Philosophies as a resource for those who wish to delve more deeply into the networks that generated the architecture of most of our cultural assumptions about reality. I think it will be useful to review the cultural era in which Alexander made his discoveries. At the turn of the 20th century, what today is called culture and intellectual capital was the accumulation of new ideas developed mostly during the previous 50 years. That atmosphere and lifestyle at the beginning of the 20th century is so completely foreign to us in the 21st that it may help to review a few of those long past standpoints. It's odd that Alexander comes almost at the same time at quantum mechanics. Maybe it was a similar structural development, something that Rupert Sheldrake has theorized about. It sounds a bit preposterous, but it actually goes hand in hand with the idea of quantum fields. And to second that, if you start to, as we have done during the last 25 lectures, I think, look into Roberto Unger and Lee Smolin's scheme, when the blockage of the Newtonian paradigm dissipates like a fog